For 6 months, Mark had been living in a marriage that felt unfamiliar, empty in a way he couldn't explain. Once filled with warmth and laughter, his relationship with Laura had become a hollow shell. The sound of her laughter was gone, the touch that once reassured him now a distant memory. Laura had changed. Conversations had dwindled to mundane exchanges about bills and chores, their emotional and physical connection disappearing. Every attempt to bridge the growing gap was met with indifference or outright dismissal. He still remembered the last time he'd reached for her. She had pulled away without a second thought, mumbling an excuse about being tired. Lying awake that night, Mark realized he couldn't even remember the last time she had reached for him willingly. Their shared dreams, their closeness, it had all faded, replaced by an invisible but impenetrable wall. Had he done something wrong? Had he failed her in some way? He replayed moments in his mind, searching for the point when everything had unraveled. But Laura refused to acknowledge anything was wrong, brushing off his concerns with clipped responses and distant eyes. He had tried everything: romantic gestures, thoughtful surprises, even suggesting therapy. But every effort was met with the same excuses. Too busy, too stressed, too tired. The silence, the unanswered questions, the growing distance. It was unbearable. Tonight, he was done pretending. After dinner, he found Laura scrolling on her phone, her face blank. Steeling himself, he stepped forward. "Laura," he said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "We need to talk." She barely glanced up. "Can it wait? I'm in the middle of something." "No, it can't." He moved in front of her, forcing her to meet his gaze. "I can't keep living like this, questioning what went wrong, wondering why you've shut me out. I need to understand." She sighed, setting her phone aside, but her posture was rigid. "What is this about now?" Mark inhaled sharply, keeping his frustration in check. "It's about us. You've pulled away, like we're just strangers under the same roof. I need to know why." Her expression hardened. "I don't know what you're talking about. You're overanalyzing everything." Something in Mark snapped. "Overanalyzing?" His voice rose, disbelief cutting through his exhaustion. "Laura, you flinch when I touch you. We barely talk. You act like I'm intruding in my own home. I'm your husband. Don't I deserve an explanation?" Her gaze turned cold, her voice eerily calm. "Laura," Mark began, his voice laced with frustration, "I don't understand what's happening. For 6 months, you've been distant, cold. This isn't you." Her gaze was unwavering. "My body is my choice," she stated flatly. "You should be asking permission before even thinking about touching me. I live life on my terms, and I won't have my boundaries crossed." Her words hit him like a brick. "What?" he muttered, struggling to process. "That's not how we were. Do you even hear yourself?" Her expression hardened. "I used to be naive, letting you influence me. But I've woken up. Women deserve more than men, and you need to start meeting my expectations." Mark felt the ground shift marketh him. The woman he'd loved was a stranger now. "What are you even talking about? I've never controlled you. Is this coming from something you've been reading?" Her eyes flared with anger. "And there it is, you're trying to make me sound irrational. But let's be real. You're just mad I stopped sleeping with you. That's all men care about, isn't it?" Mark exhaled sharply, frustration giving way to despair. "All right, Laura. If we're talking about choices, my wallet is mine. My money is my choice." Her expression darkened. "That's manipulation. You're trying to control me financially." Mark let out a dry laugh. "Manipulation? Laura, I don't even recognize you anymore." She shot to her feet, trembling with rage. "This is why I've changed, because men like you think you can control women with mind games." Mark stood as well, his patience finally snapping. "For months, I've done everything to fix this marriage, and all you've done is push me away. This isn't a marriage anymore. It's a battlefield." A tense silence filled the air, and for the first time, divorce didn't feel like giving up. Felt like freedom. The next morning, still reeling, Mark found himself parked outside a law office. Staring at the sign for White and Associates, his stomach churned. He wasn't impulsive, but he couldn't live trapped in resentment. Inside, a middle-aged lawyer, Daniel Carter, greeted him with quiet professionalism. For an hour, Mark laid everything out. The distance, Laura's transformation, her emotional and physical withdrawal. Daniel listened intently, jotting down notes, never interrupting. When Mark finally finished, Daniel leaned back in his chair, adjusting his glasses. His expression was neutral, but his tone was carefully measured. "This is a difficult situation," he began, "but not an uncommon one. When someone undergoes a significant personality shift and refuses to engage, there are usually external factors at play." Mark frowned, feeling a knot tighten in his stomach. "External factors?" he repeated. "You mean like an ideology or something personal?" Daniel gave a small shrug. "It could be ideological, sure. But it could also be something more personal." Mark's pulse quickened. "Are you saying there might be someone else?" Daniel didn't answer right away. "It's a possibility," he admitted. "But I'd caution against making assumptions without proof. Right now, your focus should be on practical next steps. You have options. We can start drafting divorce papers today, or you can take some time to gather more information before making a final decision. Clarity can be an advantage if this ends up in court." Mark exhaled slowly, absorbing the advice. "Let's hold off on the paperwork for now," he said. "I need to see how things play out first." That night, back home, Mark sat at the kitchen table, a notebook in front of him. He methodically went through their expenses: mortgage, utilities, groceries, everything they needed to sustain their household. Once he had the total, he split it in half. His portion was already covered by his income. The other half, he carefully wrote out, was what Laura needed to contribute. Then, without a word, he retrieved a small wooden box from the closet and placed it on the kitchen counter. The message was simple but unmistakable. Later, as Laura walked into the kitchen, she immediately noticed Mark sitting at the table, notebook in hand. "Laura," he said, his tone calm but firm, "this is a breakdown of our monthly expenses. I've covered my half. The box is there for you to contribute yours." She stopped in her tracks, her expression turning wary. "What is this supposed to mean?" Mark met her gaze evenly. "It means," he said, "that you've made it clear you want independence and boundaries. I'm respecting that. If we're equals in this marriage, then we're equals in sharing the responsibility that comes with it." A flush of anger crept into her face. "This is manipulation," she snapped. "You're punishing me because I refuse to play the role of some perfect wife." "No, Laura," he replied, his voice steady. "I'm simply respecting your choices. But independence comes with responsibility. For years, I've handled the financial weight of this family without question. If our dynamic is changing, then so do the terms of our arrangement." Her voice grew sharper. "You know, I don't make the kind of money you do. This isn't fair." Mark didn't blink. "Then maybe it's time for that to change," he said simply, gesturing toward the box. "You have until the end of the month." Laura's expression twisted with fury. She spun on her heel and stormed out of the kitchen, muttering accusations under her breath. Manipulation, abuse, control. Mark didn't go after her. He remained at the table, feeling something different this time. Not anger, not even frustration, just exhaustion. Over the next few weeks, he observed her closely. Outwardly, she acted as though nothing had changed, but it was clear she had no intention of making any real effort. She complained about his unreasonable expectations, made no attempt to find better work, and spent most of her time glued to her phone or chatting with friends. The wooden box remained untouched. Mark didn't confront her. He simply watched, noting how her pride had warped into sheer defiance. Every time he brought up even a minor concern, she countered with accusations of control, twisting the conversation until he was the one on trial. As the end of the month approached, the box was still empty. He wasn't surprised, but that didn't make it any less disappointing. When the bills came due, Mark returned to the kitchen, the notebook and the still empty box before him. Bracing himself, he called Laura in. She appeared moments later, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her face already set in a scowl. "What now?" Mark gestured toward the box. "The bills are due, and it's still empty," he said. "If we don't pay, we'll start racking up late fees." Laura rolled her eyes. "I'm aware," she snapped. "Stop nagging me." "Then what's the delay?" he asked, his tone calm. "We agreed you'd cover your half." Her jaw tightened, and she exhaled sharply. "Unbelievable, Mark. A real man handles the finances instead of throwing them back on his wife. You're pathetic." His grip on the pen tightened, but his voice remained measured. "And a real partner doesn't ignore her responsibilities," he said evenly. "You wanted boundaries, Laura. I've respected them. Now it's your turn." Her eyes flashed with fury, but for once, she didn't argue. Instead, she turned and stormed off, slamming the bedroom door behind her. Mark heard the sound of drawers opening and closing, her muffled muttering filling the space. Nearly half an hour later, she returned, her hands full of crumpled bills and loose change. With an exaggerated motion, she dropped it into the box, the coins clattering noisily. "There," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Happy? That's all I've got." Mark glanced at the box, then met her gaze. His expression was unreadable. "Thank you," he said quietly, but Laura wasn't finished. "You're just like every other selfish man," she hissed. "Obsessed with control. Obsessed with money." Mark didn't react. He had learned by now that engaging further was pointless, so he simply leaned back in his chair and watched her in silence. As morning light filtered into the kitchen, Mark stood by the counter, sipping his coffee. His phone rested beside him, its screen dark, but his mind was already made up. Earlier that day, Mark had finally made the call he'd been avoiding for weeks. He took a deep breath and told Daniel, "Get the papers ready." His voice was steady, but there was no denying the resignation in his tone. Daniel's response was professional, yet tinged with understanding. "It's time for a divorce. The papers will be ready in a week," Daniel assured him. A week. It felt like just the right amount of time. Long enough to watch Laura's behavior and confirm what he already knew in his heart. Their marriage was broken beyond repair. It also gave him space to mentally prepare for what was coming. He had no intention of leaving the papers on the table like some cold, impersonal transaction. He would hand them to Laura himself, not to be cruel, but to bring closure, to see her reaction, and to finally put an end to the suffocating tension in their home. The days that followed dragged on, each one giving him a clearer picture of his wife's state of mind. To his surprise, she seemed calmer. The biting remarks and sudden outbursts had lessened, replaced by a more subdued, withdrawn presence. She still spent hours glued to her phone, her eyes fixed on the screen, her lips pressed into a thin line. Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something was simmering marketh the surface. Whatever it was, he knew it wasn't peace. By the time the papers were ready, Mark felt a strange mix of relief and unease. That afternoon, he picked them up from Daniel's office, then spent the rest of the day turning everything over in his mind. This was it, the beginning of the end. Sitting at his desk, the envelope heavy in his lap, he ran through the evening in his head. He'd wait for Laura to come home, place the papers in front of her, and let her react however she chose. It wouldn't be easy, but it would be an end. But that evening, Laura threw him an unexpected curveball. She was late, nearly 2 hours past her usual time. When she finally walked through the door, Mark barely looked up. But something about the way she moved caught his attention. She seemed different. Her shoulders, normally tense with irritation, were relaxed. Her expression, which had been hardened for months, was softer. The simmering anger that had defined her presence was gone. And then, something even more shocking, she smiled at him. "Hey," she said, setting her bag down with an unusual gentleness. Mark responded cautiously. "Hey." She moved around the kitchen with an ease he hadn't seen in months, rummaging through the cupboards as if she were looking for something specific. "I thought I'd make us some tea," she murmured almost shyly. "It's been a while since we just sat and talked." Mark arched an eyebrow. "Tea?" She nodded, pulling 2 mugs from the cabinet. "Yeah. I found some sweets in the pantry, too. Thought it'd be nice to sit down for a bit." She flashed another small smile, brighter this time, and Mark felt his guard shift ever so slightly. This wasn't the Laura he had been living with for the past 6 months. It was as if, out of nowhere, she had remembered how to be the woman he had married. He lowered himself into a chair at the kitchen table, watching as she carefully poured the tea and arranged a plate of sweets. "Thanks," he said, accepting the mug she handed him. His voice was steady, but his mind was racing. "Didn't see this coming." "I know," she admitted, sitting across from him. "I've been thinking a lot lately. About us, about everything." Mark's heart gave a slight jolt. He wanted to press her, to ask what had suddenly changed, but he held back. Instead, he took a slow sip of tea and let the silence stretch between them, waiting to see where she would take the conversation. At first, they stuck to small talk, chit-chat about the weather, the neighbor's new car, and a few trivial things about the kids. But as the minutes passed, her voice took on a warmth that had been missing for so long. And yet, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Her sudden change, her soft voice, it all felt too deliberate. His mind worked to piece it together. Had she found out about his plans? Was this an attempt to salvage their marriage? Or was there something else at play? Something deeper he hadn't yet figured out? By the time they finished their tea, Mark had made up his mind. The divorce papers could wait one more day. He needed more time to watch, to listen, to figure out if this was real or just another manipulation. As they cleaned up, he stole glances at her from the corner of his eye. Outwardly, she seemed calm, almost content, but her body language told a different story. He noticed the way her fingers clenched the dishcloth a little too tightly, the subtle stiffness in her jaw when she thought he wasn't looking. Something wasn't right. Later that night, Mark moved to the dimly lit living room, laying out the bedding on the couch. It had become his routine for the past 6 weeks. His old place in their shared bed, now nothing more than a memory. The sound of running water from the bathroom filled the silence, oddly comforting in its familiarity. But when Laura emerged, hair wrapped in a towel, her skin freshly scrubbed, she surprised him once again. She leaned against the doorway, offering him a soft smile. Her voice was gentle, almost casual. "I was thinking," she began, pausing slightly, "maybe you could come back to our bedroom tonight." Mark glanced up from his makeshift bed, thrown off by the invitation. "It's been a while since we've slept in the same bed," she added, her tone light, almost hopeful. He hesitated. "I'm pretty exhausted, Laura," he said carefully. "Got a long day ahead tomorrow." Her smile faltered slightly, but she recovered quickly, masking whatever emotion had flickered across her face. "Too bad," she murmured, her voice carrying a trace of something. Regret? Sadness? He couldn't tell. She turned to leave, pausing only briefly before adding, "Well, if you change your mind, I'll be here." And with that, she disappeared down the hallway, leaving Mark sitting there, confused and uneasy. The rest of the night passed in silence. He lay awake on the couch, staring at the ceiling, thoughts circling endlessly in his mind. Why now? Of all the nights, after months of distance, anger, and rejection, why was she suddenly extending an olive branch? He wasn't sure what was going on. But one thing was certain. He wasn't about to let his guard down just yet. Of all the days for her to suddenly change, why did it have to be today, the very day he planned to give her the divorce papers? The shift in her behavior wasn't just unexpected. It felt calculated, as if she were making a move in a game he hadn't even realized they were playing. The thought gnawed at him, filling him with an uneasy curiosity. As the first rays of sunlight streamed through the curtains, Mark made up his mind. No more stalling, no more second-guessing. By the time morning fully arrived, he was already seated at the kitchen table, a fresh cup of coffee in one hand and the divorce papers resting beside him. The envelope sat there like a quiet declaration of his resolve. Laura walked in moments later, her steps light, her energy oddly bright. "Good morning, honey," she greeted him, her voice unusually warm. Mark lifted his gaze, his tone deliberately neutral. "Morning." She moved around the kitchen, pouring herself a cup of tea before settling into the chair across from him. There was something almost too cheerful about her expression, like she was putting on a performance. They exchanged small talk, nothing out of the ordinary. But then, after a few minutes, Laura's demeanor shifted just slightly. Her voice took on a softer, almost hesitant tone. "You know, Mark," she began, tilting her head with an almost playful smile. "This might sound a little forward, but would you mind lending me $150? Just for a week? I promise I'll pay you back." Mark set his coffee down slowly, his fingers tightening slightly around the handle. And just like that, the puzzle pieces fell into place. There it was. The sudden warmth, the affectionate tone. It had all been an act. Laura didn't want to reconnect. She needed money. He leaned back in his chair, leveling her with a steady gaze. $150, huh? He asked, his voice calm, unreadable. Laura's eyes lit up slightly. She let out a soft chuckle, misinterpreting his reaction. "Well, if you're feeling generous, I wouldn't say no to $200 or $500, she added with a playful smirk. Mark didn't smile. Instead, he reached for the envelope and slid it across the table toward her. "This," he said simply. Laura's smile faltered as she took the envelope, her brows knitting together in confusion. As she pulled out the papers and scanned the contents, her expression shifted. First confusion, then shock, then something closer to panic. Her fingers trembled slightly as she held up the papers. "Mark," she whispered, her voice unsteady. What is this?" He met her gaze, his tone unwavering. "It's exactly what it looks like. Divorce papers." Laura's breath hitched. "No," she said quickly, shaking her head. "Mark, this is too sudden. We can't just throw everything away like this. We need to try. I can change. Please just give me a chance." Mark exhaled slowly, his resolve unshaken. "Laura, it's too late for that," he said, his voice even but firm. "I spent months trying to figure out where we went wrong, trying to fix things, trying to bring us back to what we used to be." His eyes darkened slightly as he watched her, the weight of everything they had been through settling in his chest. "But every time I reached out, you pushed me away. You treated me like I didn't matter, like I was some stranger living in your house. And now, the moment you need something from me, you suddenly want to play the role of the wife I remember." He shook his head. "I see through it, Laura." She reached across the table, her voice thick with desperation. "Mark, you don't understand," she pleaded. "I've been going through a lot. I never meant to hurt you. I just needed time to figure things out. Please don't do this." Mark sighed, rubbing his temples. His voice was calm but carried the weight of finality. "Laura, I've had plenty of time to think. I've looked back on our marriage, on how you treated me these past few months. The distance, the manipulation, the coldness. This isn't healthy. For either of us." His eyes softened slightly, but his tone remained firm. "We both deserve better." Tears welled in Laura's eyes as she lowered her gaze to the papers in her trembling hands. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. "I don't want this." Mark's voice was quiet but resolute. "Neither do I. But it's the only way forward." He stood, picking up his coffee mug. "Take your time looking over the papers," he said. "But my decision is final." With that, he walked away, leaving Laura sitting at the table, staring at the envelope as the reality of it all sank in. The divorce. The following month was one of the hardest of Mark's life. The legal process was grueling, filled with tense negotiations, emotional exhaustion, and Laura's repeated attempts to reconcile. She cried. She begged. She swore she'd change. But Mark held firm. Too much damage had already been done. Daniel Carter, his lawyer, proved to be invaluable during it all. A seasoned professional, he approached the case with precision, ensuring Mark's finances and assets remained protected. Laura, however, found herself at a disadvantage. Her part-time job barely provided financial independence, and her attempts to secure a more favorable settlement quickly fell apart under Daniel's sharp questioning. As the weeks dragged on, her frustration became more apparent. Every attempt she made to negotiate crumbled, leaving her with far less than she had expected. For Mark, the divorce was both freeing and bittersweet. He had escaped the suffocating tension of his marriage, but the weight of what had been lost still lingered. The unexpected truth. Months later, as he stood in line at the grocery store, an unexpected voice called out to him. Turning, he found himself face to face with Sandra, one of Laura's former colleagues. They exchanged small talk, keeping it light, until she casually mentioned something that made Mark's stomach drop. "It's been crazy at work without Laura," Sandra said, shaking her head. Not that she was the most reliable, always calling in sick or disappearing for hours. Mark frowned slightly. Disappearing? Sandra hesitated. "I probably shouldn't say this, but she used to talk about some guy. A lot. Sounded like more than just a friend." Mark felt his breath slow. "Are you saying she had an affair?" Sandra gave a small, uneasy nod. "I wasn't sure at first, but yeah, I think she did. I didn't want to get involved, especially since your marriage was already—" She trailed off, wincing. Mark's mind reeled. The distance, the erratic behavior, the cold detachment. It all made sense now. "Thanks for telling me," he said quietly before leaving the store, his thoughts racing. Moving on. A month later, word reached him that Laura had moved in with a man named Kevin. Surprisingly, Mark felt nothing. No anger, no sadness, just relief. She was no longer his burden. Mark, too, had started to move on. He met Rachel, a woman who was everything Laura wasn't. Warm, kind, and genuine, with no hidden agendas. One night, as they sat on Rachel's couch watching a cheesy romantic comedy, Mark found himself laughing. Really laughing. It was a small moment, but it meant everything. For the first time in years, he felt light. He felt free. And he knew he had finally reclaimed his life. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and like.